There was a time when money had no ceiling, when wealth moved faster than consequence, and ambition believed it could outbuild time itself. These houses were not made to be lived in. They were made to endure, to prove that power could become permanent if it were carved deep enough into stone. But time does not negotiate. Families faded, fortunes fractured, and what remains today is not a dream but a question, standing silently, larger than anyone who ever owned it. In the final decades of the 19th century, the United States entered a rare and volatile moment in its history. A moment when wealth expanded faster than tradition, regulation, or restraint could contain it. This era, later known as the Gilded Age, was defined not merely by prosperity, but by excess so vast it altered how power was expressed. Railroads stitched the continent together, steel reshaped skylines, oil illuminated cities, and banking fortunes accumulated at a scale previously reserved for empires. For a small circle of families, money ceased to function as a means of comfort or security. It became a language spoken through land, stone, and scale. It was in this atmosphere that the American mansion was transformed from a home into a declaration. These structures were no longer built to shelter families, but to embody ambition. They were statements of permanence in a nation still uncertain of its own historical weight. Across the Northeast and the emerging resorts of the South, private residences began to rival and sometimes surpass the palaces of Europe. Size was no longer incidental. Grandeur was the point. Among all such monuments, one would come to represent this transformation more clearly than any other. Conceived not as a seasonal retreat or urban residence, but as a self-contained domain, this house would stretch beyond the logic of domestic life. It would demand resources not only to build, but endlessly, relentlessly, to sustain. Long before its consequences were understood, it was already becoming something more than a home. It was becoming a system. The origin of this ambition lay with a man who did not fit the popular image of an industrial titan. Unlike the railroad barons or steel magnates of his time, George Washington Vanderbilt II was not defined by factories or boardrooms. He was introspective, highly educated, and deeply influenced by European art, architecture, and intellectual culture. Travel had shaped his imagination, particularly extended stays in France, where aristocratic estates were not simply residences, but landscapes of power, carefully composed environments where architecture, agriculture, and aesthetics formed a single vision. When Vanderbilt acquired thousands of acres in the mountains of western North Carolina, his intention was not modest. The land itself was remote, rugged, and undeveloped, precisely the qualities that appealed to him. He envisioned a retreat from modern America, a place insulated from the noise and pace of industrial life. Yet almost immediately, the project began to outgrow its original purpose. What started as a country house evolved into something closer to a private kingdom. To translate this vision into stone, Vanderbilt turned to Richard Morris Hunt, the most influential architect among America's elite. Trained in Paris and steeped in the Beaux Arts tradition, Hunt understood that this commission was not about comfort or efficiency. It was about symbolism. Drawing inspiration from the Chautauquas of the Loire Valley, he designed a structure that emphasized verticality, ceremonial space, and visual dominance over the surrounding landscape. Every element was meant to communicate authority, long before a visitor ever crossed the threshold. Construction began in 1889 and quickly became one of the most complex private building projects in American history. Materials were sourced from across the country. Skilled artisans were brought in to execute work that few American craftsmen had attempted at such scale. Entire villages of laborers formed around the site, sustained solely by the demands of the house. Nothing about the process suggested restraint. Time was flexible, cost was irrelevant. Precision was absolute. Yet embedded within this achievement was a contradiction that no architect or patron openly acknowledged. The house was being built for a family, but it required the infrastructure of an institution. Its size demanded a permanent staff. Its systems required constant oversight. Heating, lighting, food service, maintenance, each function multiplied by the scale of the structure itself. The mansion was not merely large. It was operationally alive. When the house finally opened in December of 1895, its completion was celebrated as a triumph of American ambition. Newspapers described it in superlatives. Guests were overwhelmed by its scale, its library, its vast halls and formal rooms. And yet, beneath the admiration, a quieter reality had already taken hold. The house did not rest when its owners slept. It consumed resources continuously. It required attention, labor, and money in perpetuity. What had been created was not simply a home, but a burden disguised as brilliance. A structure so magnificent that it defied the rhythms of ordinary life. A place that could not easily adapt, shrink, or rest. In the glow of its inauguration, no one spoke of longevity. No one asked whether such a house could survive changing generations, shifting economies, or the inevitable erosion of fortune. But time was already moving forward. And it would not be kind to structures built without limits. What no guest could see on that first winter evening in 1895 was that the house had already begun to consume itself. From the outside, the estate appeared serene, immutable, almost timeless. But inside its walls, a different reality governed daily life. The mansion did not function like a residence. It operated like a small city one, without public funding, without municipal support, and without any natural mechanism for rest. Every corridor, every fireplace, every room existed within a delicate balance of labor and expense. And that balance, once established, could never be paused. Even during periods when the Vanderbilt family was absent, the house remained fully alive. Fires had to be kept burning to prevent damage from cold and damp. Roofs required constant inspection. Stone facades weathered aggressively under the mountain climate. Dozens of servants, maids, footmen, cooks, groundskeepers, engineers worked in shifts to maintain standards that had been set not by necessity, but by ambition. Their presence was invisible to guests, but indispensable to survival. This was the paradox at the heart of America's great houses. They were built to signify independence and dominance, yet they were fundamentally fragile. Their survival depended on uninterrupted wealth and a social structure willing to sustain permanent domestic labor. When either of those elements weakened, the house itself became vulnerable. George Vanderbilt understood this reality intellectually, but even he underestimated its scope. Annual operating costs soared into figures that would have funded entire towns elsewhere in the country. Food alone required a supply chain capable of feeding not only the family and guests, but the staff that served them. The estate's agricultural experiments, vineyards, dairies, forests were designed in part to offset costs, but they rarely succeeded at the scale required. Efficiency was never the priority. Control was. By the early years of the 20th century, the first cracks began to appear not in the stonework, but in the economic logic of the project. America was changing. Progressive-era reforms introduced new taxes, including inheritance taxes, that directly targeted the vast fortunes of families like the Vanderbilts. Wealth that once flowed freely now faced legal and political friction. The assumption that private fortunes could endure unchanged across generations was quietly eroding. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, the full weight of the house passed to his widow, Edith, and their young daughter. The mansion, once a symbol of boundless possibility, suddenly became a responsibility measured in numbers rather than dreams. Decisions that had once been aesthetic became financial. Rooms were closed. Staff was reduced. Portions of the estate were sold not out of preference, but out of necessity. World War I accelerated these pressures. Labor shortages made staffing increasingly difficult. Materials became expensive. Social attitudes shifted. Extravagance, once admired, now appeared tone-deaf in a world defined by sacrifice and uncertainty. The house had not changed, but the country around it had. And that mismatch would only grow more severe with time. What emerged during this period was a new truth, one that applied not only to this estate, but to dozens like it across the United States. These houses were not designed to adapt. Their scale resisted compromise. Their identity depended on excess. And without the uninterrupted flow of immense wealth, they faced a slow, dignified decline. Yet even as the financial burden mounted, the house resisted abandonment. Too much had been invested: money, pride, identity. To let it fail entirely would have been to acknowledge that the dream itself had been flawed. And so the family persisted, balancing legacy against solvency, tradition against survival. By the 1920s, the question was no longer whether the house could be maintained indefinitely, but how long its decline could be delayed. The answer would be shaped not by architecture, but by forces far beyond its walls: economic collapse, social transformation, and the irreversible passage of time. By the end of the 1920s, the illusion that these great houses could outlast history had begun to collapse. The forces that threatened them were not dramatic in the way architecture is dramatic. There were no sudden explosions, no singular acts of destruction. Instead, the danger arrived quietly, through numbers on balance sheets, through letters from tax offices, through the slow disappearance of a world that had once made such excess seem not only acceptable, but inevitable. The mansion remained exactly as it had been designed: immense, immovable, uncompromising, while everything around it changed. The Great Depression did not create the crisis facing America's grand estates. It revealed it. When financial markets collapsed in 1929, the fragility of inherited wealth became impossible to ignore. Fortunes that had once appeared inexhaustible were suddenly finite. Investments failed. Income streams dried up. What remained were obligations: property taxes, maintenance costs, payrolls that did not shrink simply because the economy had. A house of this scale did not know how to be poor. It could only be expensive or abandoned. For estates like Biltmore, the math became brutal. Even reduced operations required sums that few families could justify in an era when unemployment soared and public sentiment hardened against visible luxury. What had once been admired as ambition was now viewed with suspicion, even resentment. The cultural ground beneath these houses was shifting, and with it, their legitimacy. Owners across the country faced the same reckoning. Some chose liquidation, dismantling interiors piece by piece, selling tapestries, furniture, even entire wings to collectors and museums. Others simply locked the doors and walked away, leaving nature and weather to do what time inevitably does: reclaim what human pride once imposed upon it. These were not failures of architecture. They were failures of sustainability. At Biltmore, survival required transformation. Portions of the estate were opened to the public, not as an act of generosity, but as a strategy of preservation. The house began to generate revenue by becoming something its creator had never intended: a destination rather than a refuge. Visitors walked through rooms once reserved for private life, absorbing the scale and craftsmanship with awe, unaware that their admission fees were now part of the house's lifeline. This shift marked a profound change in meaning. The mansion ceased to function as a family home in the traditional sense. It became an artifact, an object of historical and cultural consumption. Its value was no longer measured by how it served its owners, but by how it could be interpreted, monetized, and justified to a modern audience. And yet, even this adaptation came at a cost. Opening such a house to the public required further investment, further staffing, further compromise. Where replaced preservation. Accessibility replaced intimacy. The house survived, but in a different form, one that blurred the line between legacy and necessity. What emerged from this period was a quiet consensus, rarely spoken aloud but widely understood. These houses were too large to be lived in as intended, and too significant to be destroyed without regret. They occupied a strange middle ground between home and monument, between burden and treasure. Their survival depended not on family lineage, but on public interest. Time, it turned out, was not neutral. It favored flexibility, modesty, and adaptability qualities these houses were never designed to possess. Stone endured, but meaning shifted. Grandeur remained visible, while relevance grew increasingly fragile. As the 20th century advanced, the question was no longer whether such houses could return to their former role. That era was gone. The question became whether they could justify their continued existence in a world that no longer measured success by scale alone. And in that question lay the beginning of their final transformation. There is a precise moment in the life of every great house when it stops belonging entirely to the people who built it. This moment does not arrive with ceremony. There is no announcement, no formal decision etched into stone. Instead, it emerges gradually, through a series of small, pragmatic choices made not to preserve meaning, but to prevent collapse. By the mid-20th century, that moment had arrived for America's grand estates. What had once been private worlds began to turn outward, compelled not by vision, but by necessity. Opening a house to the public was not an act of pride. It was an admission. For generations, these homes had been designed to exclude. Their scale imposed distance. Their rituals reinforced hierarchy. Visitors were once carefully selected, choreographed through rooms meant to impress, but never invite familiarity. Now, those same rooms were being reinterpreted. Velvet ropes replaced social codes. Guided tours replaced private gatherings. Silence was broken by footsteps, explanations, and the hum of modern curiosity. The transformation was irreversible. When a house becomes a monument, it must justify itself continuously. A private residence exists to serve its occupants. A monument exists to be understood, interpreted, and consumed. Its survival depends on relevance rather than lineage. This shift fundamentally altered the relationship between architecture and purpose. The house no longer answered to a family's needs. It answered to the public's expectations. At estates like Biltmore, this transition required a careful balancing act. Preservation demanded authenticity, yet public access introduced wear. Floors that had once felt only the weight of silk shoes now bore thousands of footsteps. Climate systems designed for domestic comfort were recalibrated to protect art and textiles. Rooms that once served emotional or ceremonial functions were redefined as educational spaces. Meaning was preserved not through use, but through explanation. This reinterpretation carried a quiet cost. When a house becomes a historical object, it freezes in time. Adaptation becomes limited. Modernization threatens authenticity. Change becomes suspect. What once lived must now perform permanence. The building survives, but its relationship with time becomes unnatural, neither alive nor allowed to decay. And yet, without this transformation, many of these houses would not exist at all. Across the United States, estates that failed to attract public interest faced a harsher fate. Some were demolished, their lands subdivided, their materials salvaged and scattered. Others lingered in abandonment, too expensive to restore, too significant to erase, slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. These ruins were reminders that architecture, no matter how grand, cannot survive without a role. The houses that endured did so by redefining themselves as cultural capital. They became symbols not of private wealth, but of a historical moment, representations of ambition, inequality, craftsmanship, and excess. In this role, they gained a new kind of protection. Public affection replaced private fortune. Educational value replaced social dominance. But this exchange was not neutral. As monuments, these houses began to shape how history itself was remembered. Tours emphasized artistry over labor, vision over exploitation, beauty over cost. The thousands of workers who built and maintained these estates often receded into the background, their lives reduced to footnotes. The architecture remained central, while the systems that sustained it, economic, social, human, became abstract. This selective memory was not malicious. It was structural. Monuments simplify. They must. To endure in public consciousness, they distill complex histories into coherent narratives. Grandeur becomes easier to celebrate than inequality. Stone is easier to admire than the invisible labor that polished it. By mid-century, the great American houses occupied a new and uneasy position. They were no longer homes in any meaningful sense. They were not fully museums either. They existed as hybrids, maintained, interpreted, protected, and yet fundamentally detached from the lives that created them. Their survival was a success story, but also a compromise. And beneath that compromise lingered a deeper question, one that would grow more urgent as time passed. What does it mean to preserve a symbol of excess in a society that increasingly values restraint? Can a structure built on unlimited wealth find moral footing in a world shaped by limits? The answer was not yet clear, but the tension was permanent. As these houses settled into their second lives as monuments, a quieter reckoning began to surface, one that architecture alone could not absorb. For decades, the story told within their walls had been carefully framed. Visitors were guided through galleries of achievement, rooms of craftsmanship, libraries of refinement. The narrative emphasized vision, taste, and ambition. But as American society moved deeper into the second half of the 20th century, the distance between admiration and discomfort narrowed. Questions once considered impolite became unavoidable. Not about how these houses were built, but about what they represented and at whose expense. The sheer scale of these estates forced a moral comparison. They had been constructed during a period when millions lived without basic security, when labor protections were minimal, and when wealth accumulation often relied on systems that concentrated power while dispersing risk downward. The houses survived as physical facts, but their meanings were no longer stable. They stood as reminders not only of artistic aspiration, but of economic imbalance frozen in stone. This tension reshaped how the public engaged with them. By the late 20th century, historic house museums were no longer able to present grandeur without context. Audiences arrived with sharper awareness, shaped by civil rights movements, labor history, and economic critique. They wanted to know who built these houses, who cleaned them, who kept them warm through winter nights while others slept. They asked about wages, working conditions, racial hierarchies, and the invisible structures that sustained visible luxury. For institutions charged with preservation, this shift posed a profound challenge. How does one honor architectural achievement without glorifying inequality? How does one tell a truthful story without collapsing the very admiration that draws visitors through the door? The answer, imperfect and evolving, lay in complexity. Interpretation expanded. Narratives widened. Servants' quarters, once hidden or ignored, became part of the tour. Account books, payroll records, and personal letters entered exhibitions. The house was no longer presented as a solitary genius of design, but as a collective product of thousands of lives, some privileged, many constrained. Grandeur remained, but it was no longer allowed to stand alone. Still, discomfort lingered. There is an unavoidable asymmetry in preserving symbols of excess. These houses are protected precisely because they are extraordinary. Their survival depends on the same imbalance that once made them possible: resources directed toward what is rare, monumental, and aesthetically dominant. Meanwhile, the modest homes of workers, immigrants, and marginalized communities are far less likely to endure. History, even when conscientiously told, remains selective. This selectivity raised deeper questions about national memory. What does a society choose to save, and why? When immense effort is devoted to preserving elite spaces, does it risk reinforcing the very hierarchies it seeks to explain? Or can preservation become a tool not of celebration, but of confrontation? For many institutions, the answer lay in reframing purpose. These houses were no longer presented as aspirational models. They became cautionary landscape spaces where visitors could confront the consequences of unchecked wealth alongside its achievements. Excess was not denied. It was contextualized. The house became a mirror rather than a pedestal. Yet even this reframing carried limits. Aesthetic beauty has its own gravity. Stone, light, proportion, and craftsmanship exert emotional pull regardless of intention. Visitors may intellectually grasp inequality, while emotionally surrendering to splendor. The architecture still speaks fluently in the language of power. And so the moral weight remains unresolved. These houses endure, not because society has agreed on their meaning, but because they hold multiple meanings at once. They are achievements and warnings. They inspire awe and unease. They ask viewers to hold contradiction without resolution. In doing so, they reflect something fundamental about the American story itself, a nation built on extraordinary possibility and profound disparity, often simultaneously. As the 21st century approached, the question was no longer whether these houses could be preserved. That had been answered. The question became whether their stories could evolve fast enough to remain honest in a world increasingly skeptical of inherited power. The houses stood ready. Stone does not resist reinterpretation. People do. As the 21st century unfolded, the great houses entered a world fundamentally different from the one that had created them. The challenge they now faced was no longer cultural acceptance or moral interpretation alone. It was survival within an age defined by limits of resources, limits of attention, limits of tolerance for excess that no longer served a clear purpose. What had once been preserved through wealth, and later through public fascination, now had to justify itself within systems governed by sustainability, climate reality, and economic efficiency. These houses had been built for permanence, yet permanence had become expensive. Climate change altered the calculus of preservation in ways earlier generations never imagined. Rising humidity threatened wood and textiles. Increasingly violent storms tested roofs and foundations, never designed for such extremes. Heating and cooling systems, already massive, became ethically fraught as energy costs rose and environmental awareness sharpened. Every decision to preserve a room carried ecological implications far beyond its walls. At the same time, the economics of attention shifted. Historic estates now competed not only with one another, but with digital experiences, global travel, and entertainment industries that offered immersion without maintenance. To survive, these houses had to become destinations, places that offered not just history, but relevance. Educational programming expanded. Events multiplied. Weddings, exhibitions, seasonal spectacles, and experiential tourism filled calendars once reserved for private life. In adapting, the houses absorbed yet another transformation. They became economic actors. Revenue streams diversified, but dependence deepened. Preservation budgets grew more complex, tied to fluctuating visitor numbers and shifting cultural trends. The house was no longer simply preserved by society, it was required to perform for it. Silence gave way to scheduling. Reflection gave way to programming. Survival demanded visibility. And yet, This visibility came with risk. As estates leaned into experience-driven models, the line between interpretation and commodification blurred. History risked becoming aesthetic backdrop. Complexity gave way to digestibility. The pressure to attract audiences threatened to simplify narratives that had taken decades to expand. The house survived, but the integrity of its story required constant defense. Still, abandonment was no longer an option. The stakes were too high. These structures had become irreplaceable archives, not only of wealth, but of craftsmanship, labor systems, environmental manipulation, and social hierarchy. To lose them would be to erase evidence of how power once shaped space at its most extreme. Thus, preservation entered its most paradoxical phase. To honor the past, these houses had to change. To remain authentic, they had to evolve. They stood as reminders that sustainability is not only environmental or financial, but historical. It requires the willingness to confront what should endure and what must be reinterpreted. By now, the houses were no longer defended as symbols of aspiration. They were defended as instruments of understanding. They existed to teach not how to build without limits, but what happens when limits are ignored. Their continued presence was justified not by beauty alone, but by the lessons embedded in their scale. In this role, they became strangely contemporary. In a century wrestling with inequality, resource scarcity, and the consequences of excess, these houses no longer spoke only of the past. They spoke of choices, of systems, of outcomes that unfold slowly, but relentlessly. Stone endured, but certainty did not. And as debates about wealth, responsibility, and sustainability intensified, the great houses stood quietly at the center, unchanged in form, transformed in meaning, waiting for the final question history would ask of them. In the final accounting, these houses confront us with a truth that no ledger ever recorded. They were built to defeat time, yet they now exist because time defeated those who built them. When the last generation capable of sustaining such estates faded from the scene, the houses did not collapse in protest. They remained. Stone endured where certainty did not. What vanished was the belief that wealth alone could anchor meaning indefinitely. What remained was evidence immovable, unarguable of what happens when ambition is allowed to grow without reflection. These houses were never meant to explain themselves. They were designed to impress, to overwhelm, to silence questions through scale. Their builders assumed admiration would be automatic and permanent. That assumption did not survive the century. What followed instead was reinterpretation, discomfort, and eventually, reckoning. Today, when visitors walk through these rooms, they do so in a world fundamentally altered from the one that produced them. They arrive shaped by economic volatility, environmental anxiety, and a cultural skepticism toward inherited power. They do not ask the same questions guests once did. They ask harder ones. Not how magnificent, but why? Not how much did it cost, but what did it take? The houses answer without speaking. They reveal a system in which excess was not accidental, but structural, where accumulation was rewarded not for restraint, but for scale, where the physical environment became a stage upon which dominance could be rehearsed daily. These estates were not isolated anomalies. They were logical outcomes of an economic moment that encouraged expansion without consequence, until consequences arrived all at once. And arrive they did. What history makes clear is that the downfall of these houses was not caused by mismanagement alone, nor by moral awakening, nor by singular events like war or depression. It was caused by mismatch. A mismatch between permanence and reality, between scale and adaptability, between the fantasy of endless growth and the inevitability of limits. No house, no matter how grand, can exist outside the systems that surround it. When those systems change, architecture must either transform or fail. These houses transformed, but only after shedding their original purpose. In doing so, they lost something essential, the illusion that they were self-justifying. Their survival today is conditional. It depends on explanation, interpretation, and relevance. They must teach. They must contextualize. They must invite scrutiny rather than command reverence. This is not weakness. It is maturity earned slowly, under pressure. And yet, there is no neat moral resolution. These houses continue to enchant even as they unsettle. Beauty remains powerful, regardless of its origins. Craftsmanship still commands respect. Visitors feel awe, even when they understand the cost behind it. This tension cannot be resolved, only acknowledged. The houses endure precisely because they refuse simplicity. They force us to hold opposing truths at once. That extraordinary beauty can emerge from unequal systems. That preservation can both illuminate and obscure. That admiration and critique are not opposites, but partners in honest memory. In this sense, the houses no longer belong to the families who built them, nor even to the institutions that maintain them. They belong to the questions they provoke. They are not answers. They are evidence. As the world confronts new forms of excess digital, financial, environmental, the relevance of these structures sharpens rather than fades. They remind us that the consequences of unchecked accumulation do not arrive immediately. They unfold across generations. They settle into landscapes. They wait. Stone has patience. What these houses ultimately teach is not how to build, but how to reckon. They demonstrate that legacies cannot be controlled once released into time. That meaning drifts. That monuments survive, not by insisting on their original story, but by allowing themselves to be reread. In that sense, they have outlived their creators more completely than anyone intended. They no longer promise immortality through wealth. They offer instead a quieter, sterner lesson, that endurance without reflection is hollow, and reflection without evidence is impossible. These houses give us the evidence. They stand, not as triumphs to be repeated, but as records to be understood, as warnings rendered in stone, as achievements inseparable from their consequences. They do not ask forgiveness. They do not demand admiration. They simply remain. And in remaining, they invite us each generation, in turn, to decide what we will do differently. Now that we know how this story ends, when the film ends, the houses remain. This is perhaps their most unsettling quality. Long after the final narration fades, after the credits roll and the audience leaves, the buildings stand exactly where they have always stood. They do not acknowledge conclusion. They do not signal closure. They persist in silence, unmoved by interpretation, indifferent to judgment. In that silence, a different kind of story begins. Without the framing of history, without the guidance of curators or scholars, these houses become pure presence. They occupy land, cast shadows, absorb weather, and age at a pace imperceptible to human attention. Moss grows, stone darkens, wood contracts and expands with the seasons. Time resumes its work, unconcerned with symbolism. This is the stage of existence the original builders never imagined. They planned for longevity, but not for ambiguity. They assumed their intentions would remain legible, that the meaning of scale, symmetry, and expense would be self-evident across generations. Instead, the houses have outlived not only their creators, but the cultural logic that once made them intelligible. Today, a visitor may stand in a grand hall and feel wonder without reverence, curiosity without loyalty. The emotional contract has changed. The house no longer commands allegiance. It invites contemplation. And contemplation is dangerous territory for monuments. In contemplation, contradictions surface. One notices how empty the rooms feel, without bodies trained to inhabit them. How inefficient the spaces are by modern standards. How much labor once flowed, invisibly through corridors, now walked slowly, deliberately, by strangers. The house begins to feel less like a triumph, and more like an artifact of overreach. Yet it does not collapse under that realization. Instead, it absorbs it. These houses have become mirrors not of aspiration, but of consequence. They reflect back to each generation what that generation is prepared to see. In times of abundance, they appear romantic. In times of austerity, they appear excessive. In moments of crisis, they appear accusatory. Their meaning is not fixed because society is not fixed. That adaptability, paradoxically, is what allows them to endure. In this way, the houses have achieved a form of relevance their builders never intended. Not as models to imitate, but as references to interrogate. They offer scale without instruction, beauty without endorsement, history without resolution. They do not tell us what to think. They force us to think. And that may be their final function. In a century increasingly defined by impermanence, digital wealth, virtual space, transient attention, these structures remain stubbornly physical. They demand maintenance. They resist compression. They insist that choices, once materialized, do not disappear simply because beliefs change. The houses remind us that the built world is a record of values made concrete. That architecture does not forget. That landscapes remember what societies try to move past. There is no redemption arc waiting for these buildings. No final moral victory. Their presence is not a solution. It is a reminder. A reminder that excess leaves traces. That ambition reshapes environments. That consequences, once built, must be lived with. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the greatest service these houses now provide is not inspiration, preservation, or even education, but restraint. They stand as completed sentences from a past era, sentences we can read, analyze, and decide not to repeat. They do not warn loudly. They do not instruct clearly. They simply remain. And in that remaining, they ask one final question, not of history, but of us, now that we know how this story unfolds. What kind of structures will we choose to leave behind?